Ladies and gentlemen, today we step back in time to one of the most defining battles of the ancient world, the Battle of Zama, fought in 202 BCE. This battle marked the climax of the Second Punic War, where two legendary generals, Hannibal Barca of Carthage and Scipio Africanus of Rome, clashed in a struggle that would decide the fate of the Mediterranean. The Battle of Zama was the defining moment of the Second Punic War, a conflict that had raged between Rome and Carthage for 17 years, 218 to 202 BCE. This war was one of the most intense and destructive of the ancient world, filled with legendary battles, dramatic shifts in momentum, and the rise of two of history's greatest generals, Hannibal Barca and Scipio Africanus. For nearly 2 decades, Hannibal had terrorized the Roman Republic, leading his forces across the treacherous Alps and delivering devastating defeats at Trebia, 218 BCE, Lake Trasimene, 217 BCE, and Cannae, 216 BCE. The Battle of Cannae, in particular, was one of the bloodiest defeats in Roman history, where Hannibal's outnumbered army surrounded and annihilated over 50,000 Roman soldiers in a single day. This sent shockwaves through the Republic, leaving Rome on the brink of collapse. Yet, despite his military brilliance, Hannibal failed to deliver the final blow. Rome refused to surrender and instead adopted a new strategy, avoiding large-scale battles with Hannibal while gradually cutting off his reinforcements and weakening his position in Italy. Meanwhile, a young Roman general, Scipio Africanus, was rising to prominence. Unlike many Roman commanders before him, Scipio studied Hannibal's tactics and adapted his own strategies accordingly. Instead of engaging Hannibal in Italy, Scipio took the war to Spain and Africa, dismantling Carthage's overseas empire and forcing Hannibal to return home. By 202 BC, the war had reached its final chapter. Carthage, desperate to defend itself, recalled Hannibal from Italy to face Scipio's invasion of North Africa. The fate of both Rome and Carthage would be decided in a single, climactic battle, the Battle of Zama. This was not just another battle, it was the moment that would determine which civilization would dominate the Mediterranean world. The stakes had never been higher, and both generals knew that victory here meant the difference between glory and destruction. With their armies assembled, two of the greatest military minds in history prepared for the ultimate confrontation. The plains of Zama would become the stage for a clash that would reshape the ancient world forever. The Battle of Zama was more than just a military engagement. It was the long-awaited showdown between two of the greatest generals in history, Hannibal Barca of Carthage and Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus of Rome. These two men were brilliant strategists, masters of warfare, and symbols of resilience, but they came from vastly different backgrounds and had traveled very different paths to reach this moment. Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian genius. Hannibal was the son of Hamilcar Barca, the Carthaginian commander who had fought in the First Punic War and raised his son with a deep hatred for Rome. From an early age, Hannibal was trained in warfare, swearing an oath to his father that he would never befriend the Romans. At just 26 years old, he took command of the Carthaginian army in Spain and immediately launched one of the most daring military campaigns in history. Instead of attacking Rome by sea, as many expected, Hannibal did the unthinkable. He led his army, including war elephants, across the Alps in the dead of winter. This feat alone cemented his reputation as a bold and fearless leader. Once in Italy, he systematically destroyed Roman armies in a series of breathtaking victories, most notably at Cannae, 216 BCE, where he encircled and annihilated a vastly superior Roman force. His name became synonymous with terror in Rome, and his tactical brilliance left the Republic struggling for survival. Yet, despite all his victories, Hannibal could never deliver the final, decisive blow. Rome refused to surrender, and as the years dragged on, his position in Italy weakened. Without reinforcements from Carthage, Hannibal was forced to fight a war of attrition. Meanwhile, in Rome, a young general was rising to challenge him. Scipio Africanus, the Roman prodigy. Scipio Africanus was the exact opposite of Hannibal in many ways. Unlike Hannibal, who had fought his way up through the ranks, Scipio was born into Roman aristocracy, the son of a prominent general. However, he proved to be more than just a privileged nobleman. He was a military genius in his own right. Scipio had witnessed the horror of Cannae as a young officer, but instead of fearing Hannibal, he studied his tactics, learned from his maneuvers, and even improved upon them. When given command of the Roman forces in Spain, Scipio demonstrated his brilliance by systematically dismantling Carthaginian strongholds, culminating in the capture of New Carthage, 209 BCE. This not only crippled Carthage's power in Spain but also deprived Hannibal of crucial reinforcements. Realizing that Hannibal was unbeatable in Italy, Scipio devised a bold plan: attack Carthage directly and force Hannibal to defend his homeland. The Roman Senate, though hesitant at first, eventually gave him the green light. Once in North Africa, Scipio secured a powerful ally, King Massinissa of Numidia, whose elite cavalry would play a decisive role in the upcoming battle. The final duel. Now, in 202 BCE, the stage was set for the final confrontation. Hannibal, the undefeated Carthaginian commander who had terrorized Rome for nearly 2 decades, now faced Scipio, the young Roman general who had learned from his every move. Both men had spent their lives preparing for this moment, and both knew that the fate of their nations depended on the outcome. Before the battle, Hannibal and Scipio even met for a brief diplomatic discussion, possibly hoping to negotiate peace. But there was no agreement. War was inevitable. The clash at Zama would determine not just the fate of Rome and Carthage, but also which of these legendary generals would emerge victorious in the greatest military rivalry of the ancient world. For nearly 16 years, Hannibal Barca had waged a relentless campaign in Italy, bringing Rome to the brink of collapse. His victories at Trebia, 218 BCE, Lake Trasimene, 217 BCE, and Cannae, 216 BCE, had made him the most feared general of his time. Yet, despite these triumphs, Rome refused to surrender. Over time, Hannibal's once mighty army began to dwindle, with no reinforcements coming from Carthage. Meanwhile, the Romans, under the command of Scipio Africanus, had been gaining strength and shifting the war's focus to Spain and North Africa. The situation in Carthage. While Hannibal was fighting in Italy, the political and military situation in Carthage had grown desperate. Rome's navy had tightened its grip on the western Mediterranean, cutting off Carthage's ability to send supplies and reinforcements to its struggling forces abroad. To make matters worse, Scipio Africanus had launched an invasion of North Africa, striking at the very heart of Carthaginian territory. Scipio's campaign in Africa was devastating for Carthage. He defeated the Carthaginian armies in battle and secured a crucial alliance with King Massinissa of Numidia, whose elite cavalry had once fought alongside Carthage but now joined Rome. With each victory, Scipio pushed closer to Carthage itself, forcing its leaders into a desperate situation. They had only one hope left: to recall their greatest commander. Hannibal's departure from Italy. In 203 BCE, Hannibal received the urgent message from Carthage: return immediately and defend the homeland. It was a moment of bitter irony. After spending nearly 2 decades in Italy, fighting to bring Rome to its knees, Hannibal was now forced to abandon his long campaign and return to protect Carthage from destruction. Hannibal's departure from Italy was not just a strategic move, it was the symbolic end of his dream to conquer Rome. For years, he had hoped for reinforcements from Carthage or an uprising among Rome's allies, but neither came. His once mighty army, which had crossed the Alps in one of history's greatest feats, was now reduced to a shadow of its former self, struggling to survive in enemy territory. He had never lost a major battle in Italy, yet he was leaving as a commander who had failed to break Rome's will. As he boarded his ships and set sail for Africa, Hannibal must have known that he was heading into his final, most difficult battle. He was about to face an enemy who had learned from him, adapted to his tactics, and was now waiting for him with a powerful, well-trained army. He was no longer the young, unstoppable general who had crossed the Alps. He was now a veteran commander fighting for the survival of his homeland. Hannibal's arrival in Africa. When Hannibal returned to Carthage, he found a city in a state of panic and desperation. The once powerful Carthaginian empire was now on the defensive, its army weakened, and its allies abandoning it. Still, his presence alone revived hope. He quickly gathered whatever forces he could, including a mix of Carthaginian infantry, mercenaries, and war elephants, but they were not the battle-hardened veterans he had led in Italy. Many of them were new recruits, inexperienced, and untested in war. Despite these challenges, Hannibal did not lose confidence. He reorganized his army, developed a battle plan, and prepared for a final stand against Scipio. The war, which had begun with his daring invasion of Italy, would now end in Africa, on the plains of Zama. The ultimate test of his leadership and strategy was about to take place, and the fate of Carthage depended on the outcome. One of the most striking features of the Battle of Zama was Hannibal's use of war elephants, a tactic that had long been associated with Carthaginian warfare. These massive beasts, often described as the tanks of the ancient battlefield, were meant to strike fear into the enemy, break enemy formations, and cause chaos among infantry and cavalry alike. At Zama, Hannibal deployed approximately 80 war elephants, hoping they would give his army the advantage it needed to defeat Scipio's disciplined Roman legions. However, while elephants had proven effective in past battles, their success depended heavily on terrain, training, and control, factors that would work against Hannibal on this occasion. The role of war elephants in ancient warfare. For centuries, war elephants had been used by various civilizations, including the Persians, Indians, and Carthaginians, as both a psychological and physical weapon. Their sheer size and strength made them formidable on the battlefield, capable of trampling enemy soldiers, breaking through formations, and even overturning chariots. In addition to their physical power, the sight and sound of a charging elephant, trumpeting loudly, kicking up dust, and carrying heavily armored riders, could cause panic among enemy troops and horses, often making them flee before combat even began. Hannibal had previously used elephants in his campaign against Rome, most famously when crossing the Alps in 218 BCE. However, the harsh conditions killed most of them before they could be effectively deployed in Italy. At Zama, he had the opportunity to use them in greater numbers, hoping they would disrupt Scipio's well-organized legions before the main infantry engagement. Hannibal's plan for the elephants at Zama. Hannibal placed his war elephants at the front of his army, intending to send them charging into the Roman ranks at the beginning of the battle. His plan was simple, yet potentially devastating. The elephants would charge first, breaking through the Roman front lines. The Roman formations would collapse, causing confusion and disorder. With the Roman ranks in chaos, Carthaginian infantry and cavalry would follow up, overwhelming Scipio's forces and securing victory. If the elephants succeeded in breaking Scipio's disciplined formations, Hannibal could gain an early advantage and dictate the flow of the battle. However, Scipio was well prepared for this tactic and had devised a brilliant counter-strategy. Scipio's counter-tactics, turning the elephants against Hannibal. Unlike many Roman generals before him, Scipio Africanus had extensively studied Hannibal's tactics and prepared accordingly. He knew that elephants, while powerful, were not invincible. They could be unpredictable, difficult to control, and vulnerable to disciplined tactics. Rather than panicking or scattering his troops, Scipio used careful planning to neutralize the elephant charge. To counter the elephants, Scipio created open lanes in his infantry formation. Instead of forming a solid wall of soldiers that could be trampled, Scipio arranged his troops in gaps that ran through the ranks. As the elephants charged, they would run harmlessly through these lanes rather than crashing into Roman soldiers. Used loud sounds to frighten and confuse the elephants. Roman trumpets and shouting startled the animals, making some of them hesitate or even turn around. Sent skirmishers to attack the elephants before they reached the Roman lines. Lightly armed troops threw javelins and spears at the elephants, wounding and agitating them. Exploited the elephants' unpredictability. Many elephants, confused by the noise and open gaps, turned back and trampled Carthaginian soldiers instead of Romans. The failure of the elephant charge. Instead of breaking the Roman lines, the elephants caused more harm to Hannibal's own army than to Scipio's. Some of them panicked, running wild and trampling Carthaginian soldiers, while others were forced into Rome's open lanes, rendering them ineffective. The tactic that was meant to give Hannibal an early advantage had instead backfired. Although the elephants had been a major part of Hannibal's battle strategy, Scipio's ability to neutralize them demonstrated the superiority of Roman discipline and adaptability. With the elephants out of the way, the battle now became a contest between the infantry and cavalry, where Scipio's strategic planning would again prove decisive. One of the most critical elements in the Battle of Zama was the role of the Numidian cavalry, which played a decisive part in securing Rome's victory. Unlike previous encounters where Rome struggled against Hannibal's superior cavalry, this time, Scipio Africanus had an ace up his sleeve, an alliance with King Massinissa of Numidia, whose elite cavalry would tip the scales in Rome's favor. The importance of cavalry in ancient warfare. In ancient battles, cavalry was often the key to victory, providing speed, mobility, and the ability to strike at an enemy's vulnerable flanks. A well-trained cavalry force could outmaneuver infantry formations, striking from the sides or rear, pursue and destroy retreating enemy forces, ensuring a total victory, disrupt enemy formations, causing confusion and panic. Hannibal had used cavalry brilliantly in his earlier battles, particularly at Cannae, 216 BCE, where his superior horsemen had encircled and annihilated a much larger Roman army. However, at Zama, the cavalry advantage belonged to Scipio and Rome, thanks to King Massinissa and his Numidian riders. Who were the Numidians? Numidia was an ancient kingdom in North Africa, located in modern-day Algeria and Tunisia. The Numidians were known for their exceptional horsemanship, often riding without saddles or bridles, controlling their horses with only their knees and minimal reins. This made them incredibly fast, agile, and highly effective in battle. Unlike the heavily armored cavalry used by some ancient armies, the Numidian cavalry relied on speed and hit-and-run tactics, using javelins to harass enemies before retreating quickly. This style of warfare made them especially valuable in open-field battles, where they could easily outmaneuver slower enemy forces. How Massinissa joined Rome. Initially, Numidia was divided between two rival kings, Syphax, who supported Carthage, and Massinissa, who admired Rome. During Scipio's campaign in North Africa, he forged an alliance with Massinissa, promising him full control over Numidia if he helped Rome defeat Carthage. Massinissa eagerly accepted, knowing that victory alongside Rome would make him the undisputed ruler of Numidia. With Massinissa on his side, Scipio gained access to some of the finest cavalry in the ancient world. This proved to be a game-changer at Zama, where the Numidian riders would play a crucial role. The role of the Numidian cavalry at Zama. As the battle began, Hannibal's Carthaginian cavalry was outmatched from the start. While he had some cavalry forces of his own, they were inferior in both numbers and quality compared to the combined forces of Massinissa's Numidians and Scipio's Roman cavalry. The Numidians, positioned on the right flank of the Roman army, clashed with Hannibal's left-wing cavalry. Their superior speed and agility allowed them to quickly overwhelm the Carthaginian horsemen, driving them off the battlefield. Meanwhile, the Roman cavalry on the other flank defeated the Carthaginian right-wing cavalry, forcing both enemy cavalry forces into retreat. However, the true decisive moment came later in the battle. Unlike in previous battles where Roman cavalry often left the battlefield after chasing off enemy horsemen, Scipio had planned something different. He ordered the Numidian and Roman cavalry to regroup, rather than pursuing the fleeing Carthaginians too far. Then, at a critical moment, when Hannibal's infantry was fully engaged with Scipio's legions, the Numidian cavalry returned to the battlefield, this time attacking from behind. With a devastating charge, they struck Hannibal's forces in the rear, causing mass panic and sealing Carthage's fate. The game-changer in the war. The Numidian cavalry's intervention was the final blow to Hannibal's army. His troops, already struggling against Rome's disciplined infantry, now found themselves surrounded and crushed from all sides. This masterstroke of coordination between Scipio's infantry and Massinissa's cavalry ensured that Rome emerged victorious. Without the Numidian cavalry, the battle could have gone differently. But with their superior mobility, tactical brilliance, and perfect timing, they turned the tide of battle and helped end the Second Punic War in Rome's favor. The Battle of Zama was not just a contest between two great generals, Hannibal and Scipio. It was also a clash between two fundamentally different military systems, the highly disciplined, well-trained Roman legions and the battle-hardened but diverse Carthaginian army. This battle would test whether experience on the battlefield could outweigh strict discipline and strategic organization. The Roman military system, discipline, training, and cohesion. The strength of the Roman military lay in its unmatched discipline, rigorous training, and highly organized structure. Unlike Carthage, which often relied on mercenaries and allied troops, Rome's army was primarily composed of citizen soldiers who had undergone extensive training. By the time of the Battle of Zama, Rome had adapted and evolved its military strategy, learning from its past defeats against Hannibal. 1. The Roman legion, the most advanced fighting force of its time. The Roman army at Zama was organized into legions, a system that had already proven superior to the older Greek-style phalanx formation used by many ancient armies. The legion's key advantages included flexibility in battle. Unlike the rigid phalanx, the legion could adapt quickly to changing battlefield conditions. Well-trained soldiers. Roman soldiers, or legionaries, underwent rigorous training, ensuring they could maintain formation even under extreme pressure. Chain of command. The Roman army had a clear hierarchy, with centurions, officers, leading smaller units, ensuring that orders were executed efficiently. Tactical coordination. Roman soldiers were trained to fight as a unit, rather than relying on individual heroics. These qualities allowed the Roman army to withstand even the most ferocious attacks, regroup under pressure, and execute complex battlefield maneuvers with precision. 2. Scipio's strategic innovations. Scipio Africanus had studied Hannibal's tactics for years, and he understood that Rome could not defeat Carthage by brute force alone. Instead, he introduced several key innovations that would prove crucial at Zama. Countering the war elephants. Instead of standing in tight formations, Scipio ordered his troops to create open lanes, allowing the elephants to pass through harmlessly. Luring the Carthaginian cavalry away. Knowing that cavalry often pursued retreating enemies, Scipio baited Hannibal's horsemen into chasing the Roman and Numidian cavalry, taking them away from the battlefield. Using reserves strategically. Unlike in earlier battles, where Roman forces had collapsed once the front line was broken, Scipio kept a strong reserve force that could be deployed at the decisive moment. By focusing on discipline, coordination, and adaptability, Scipio ensured that his army could stand firm against the Carthaginian assault. The Carthaginian military system. Experience, diversity, and tactical brilliance. Carthage, unlike Rome, did not rely on a standing army of citizen soldiers. Instead, it recruited troops from various regions and backgrounds, including Libyan and Carthaginian infantry, the backbone of the army, well-trained but fewer in number. Iberian, Spanish, mercenaries, fierce warriors skilled in close combat. Gallic and Ligurian warriors, wild and unpredictable fighters. Numidian cavalry before Masiniss's defection, some of the best horsemen in the ancient world. War elephants, used to break enemy formations and cause panic. While this diversity made the Carthaginian army highly adaptable, it also had significant weaknesses. Different units had different fighting styles and levels of discipline, making it harder to coordinate attacks compared to the highly unified Roman legions. 1. Hannibal's army, experienced but disadvantaged. By 202 BCE, Hannibal's forces were not the same veterans who had won victories at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae. His best troops had been lost over the years, and while his new recruits were eager to fight, they lacked the discipline and experience of Rome's professional soldiers. His frontline troops consisted of mercenaries and recently recruited soldiers, who were not as reliable as his veteran warriors. His second line contained more disciplined Carthaginian and Libyan soldiers who had fought in Italy, but were still fewer in number. His third line was made up of battle-hardened veterans from his Italian campaign, his most trusted troops. However, these warriors were positioned at the rear, meaning they could not engage immediately. Hannibal hoped that by wearing down the Romans with his first two lines, his veterans could finish them off in the final phase of the battle. However, Scipio's strategy prevented this from happening as planned. The battle, discipline triumphs over experience. When the battle began, Hannibal's forces fought fiercely, but the lack of coordination among his different units proved costly. His first line of mercenaries and recruits engaged the Romans, but were quickly overpowered. When the second line of Carthaginian and Libyan troops moved forward, the retreating mercenaries collided with them, creating chaos in the Carthaginian ranks. Meanwhile, Scipio's legions remained disciplined and coordinated, executing their tactics flawlessly. Even as Hannibal's elite veterans entered the battle, they found themselves facing a fresh Roman reserve force, which had been kept back specifically for this moment. This clash demonstrated the superiority of a disciplined, well-organized military force over an army that relied heavily on individual experience and diverse fighting styles. The Roman army's ability to maintain formation, execute strategies with precision, and adapt to battlefield conditions ultimately gave Scipio the upper hand. As the battle raged on at Zama, the moment of truth arrived, the final infantry clash that would determine the fate of Carthage and Rome. Both Hannibal and Scipio Africanus had fought hard to gain an advantage, using their best tactics and military strategies. Hannibal had deployed his war elephants to break Roman lines, but Scipio's well-planned countermeasures had neutralized them. The Numidian cavalry, now fighting for Rome under Massinissa, had decisively defeated Hannibal's horsemen, leaving the Carthaginian flanks exposed. With cavalry removed from the battlefield, the final phase of the battle came down to a brutal and decisive infantry confrontation, a test of strength, endurance, and discipline. Hannibal's infantry strategy, a three-line defense. Hannibal knew that he was at a disadvantage, but he had designed a three-layered infantry strategy to compensate for it. His hope was that the Romans would become exhausted fighting through multiple lines of defense, allowing his most battle-hardened troops to finish them off in the final phase of the battle. 1. The first line, mercenaries and recruits. At the front of his army, Hannibal placed a mixed force of mercenaries and newly recruited soldiers, many of whom had never fought under his command before. These included Iberian, Spanish, warriors, Gauls, Ligurians, and other hired soldiers from across Carthage's vast trade network. While they were skilled fighters in their own right, they lacked the discipline and coordination of the Roman legions. Hannibal's plan was for these mercenaries to wear down the Romans, forcing them to engage in intense hand-to-hand combat. However, there was an underlying problem. These mercenaries had no deep loyalty to Carthage. Unlike Roman soldiers, who fought for their homeland, many of Hannibal's frontline troops fought for pay. As the Roman legions advanced in tight, disciplined formations, they quickly overpowered the mercenaries. The unorganized nature of these troops meant that they fought individually rather than as a cohesive unit, which made them vulnerable to the well-drilled and coordinated Roman infantry formations. As the first Carthaginian line began to break, the mercenaries retreated in disorder, creating chaos within their own ranks. Hannibal had expected them to at least slow the Roman advance, but their collapse was faster than he had hoped. This retreat caused immediate problems, as the routing mercenaries ran straight into the second line of Carthaginian troops, causing further disorder in Hannibal's army. 2. The second line, Carthaginian and Libyan infantry. Behind the first wave, Hannibal had positioned his more disciplined Carthaginian and Libyan troops. These were well-trained soldiers, loyal to Carthage, who had seen years of combat. They were expected to hold their ground firmly once the mercenaries had done their job of weakening the Romans. However, when the broken mercenaries ran into the second line, confusion erupted. The disciplined Carthaginian troops hesitated, unsure whether to let the mercenaries pass or force them to stand and fight. Many mercenaries, fearing execution for their retreat, turned and fought once again, but against their own side. This internal struggle created even more disarray in the Carthaginian lines, giving the Romans a huge advantage. Seizing this moment, Scipio ordered his legions to press forward aggressively, striking at the disorganized Carthaginian second line. The superior training and discipline of the Roman troops allowed them to push through, forcing Hannibal's second line into a desperate defensive position. 3. The third line, Hannibal's veteran troops. At the rear of Hannibal's army stood his most trusted and experienced soldiers, the hardened veterans from his Italian campaign. These men had fought with him for over 16 years, surviving countless battles, enduring harsh winters, and defeating some of Rome's best generals. These were the warriors who had fought at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae, the same soldiers who had once humiliated Rome on its own soil. Unlike the first two lines, these men were battle-tested professionals, highly disciplined and fiercely loyal to Hannibal. They had not been committed earlier because Hannibal had saved them for the final and decisive moment of the battle. However, by the time Hannibal's veterans were fully engaged, the situation had already turned against him. The first two lines had collapsed, and the Romans were still fresh and organized, thanks to Scipio's superior tactics. Scipio's infantry strategy, the strength of the Roman legion. Scipio's success in this final clash was due to his strategic use of reserves. Unlike Hannibal, who had placed his best troops at the rear in hopes of a final counterattack, Scipio had kept a strong reserve force that could be deployed when needed. He ensured that his frontline soldiers did not become exhausted early in the battle. He rotated fresh troops into the fight as the Carthaginians weakened. His men maintained formation and discipline, allowing them to fight efficiently even as the battle dragged on. Now, as the Romans closed in on Hannibal's veterans, the last remaining hope for Carthage was a direct infantry struggle between two of the finest fighting forces in history. However, the battlefield conditions heavily favored Scipio. The Roman cavalry had already returned after defeating the Carthaginian horsemen. Hannibal's first two infantry lines had caused disorganization in his own army. Scipio's reserves ensured that fresh Roman troops could continue pressing forward. With every moment, the battle tipped further in favor of Rome. The final clash was now a brutal, close-quarters engagement, with swords clashing, shields breaking, and soldiers fighting desperately for survival. The pivotal moment. Both sides knew that whoever broke first would lose the battle. Hannibal's veterans, despite their incredible skill, were outnumbered, exhausted, and fighting against a well-organized Roman force that had sustained fewer losses. Meanwhile, Scipio's Numidian cavalry, having already driven Hannibal's horsemen from the battlefield, was preparing to return and strike from behind. The final infantry clash at Zama was a test of endurance, strategy, and pure willpower. Scipio's ability to keep his legions disciplined and fresh while exploiting weaknesses in Hannibal's army was proving to be a decisive factor. Hannibal's veterans, though formidable, were now in a desperate struggle for survival. As the infantry clash at Zama raged on, the battle remained fiercely contested. Hannibal's veteran troops, hardened by years of campaigning in Italy, were locked in brutal combat with Scipio's disciplined Roman legions. However, while the infantry fought desperately in the center, another critical event was unfolding on the battlefield, the unexpected return of the Roman and Numidian cavalry. This moment would prove to be the final turning point, leading to one of the most decisive victories in ancient history. The initial cavalry engagement, the battle's first phase. At the start of the battle, the Numidian cavalry under Massinissa and the Roman cavalry led by Laelius had engaged Hannibal's Carthaginian and mercenary horsemen on the flanks. Unlike previous battles where Rome's cavalry had been weaker, this time Scipio had the advantage, thanks to his alliance with King Massinissa of Numidia. Massinissa's highly mobile Numidian riders outmaneuvered Hannibal's cavalry. The Roman cavalry, although not as skilled as the Numidians, fought with discipline and coordination. As the two sides clashed, Scipio's superior cavalry tactics forced the Carthaginian horsemen to retreat. In many battles, once cavalry forces were driven off, they would chase the fleeing enemy horsemen far away from the battlefield, preventing them from playing any further role in the fight. However, at Zama, Scipio had a different strategy in mind. The tactical decision, not pursuing too far. Instead of allowing his cavalry to pursue Hannibal's retreating horsemen for miles, Scipio had given clear orders. Do not chase the enemy too far. Instead, regroup and return to the battlefield when the time is right. Wait for the right moment to strike at the Carthaginian infantry from the rear. Coordinate with the Roman legions, ensuring that the cavalry's attack would come at the most decisive point in the battle. This decision showed Scipio's strategic genius. In previous Roman defeats, such as the Battle of Cannae, 216 BCE, Hannibal had used his superior cavalry to surround and destroy the Roman army. Scipio had learned from this and was now about to turn the tables on Hannibal. The battle's pivotal moment, the infantry stalemate. As the battle progressed, both armies were locked in a fierce infantry struggle. Hannibal's veterans, though outnumbered, were fighting ferociously, holding their ground against the relentless Roman legions. Meanwhile, Scipio's forces, though disciplined and determined, were beginning to feel the strain of prolonged combat. For a brief moment, the battle hung in the balance. The Romans had managed to break through Hannibal's first two lines, but his veteran troops remained a formidable force. Neither side could gain a clear advantage, as both armies were evenly matched in terms of skill and resilience. If no outside factor intervened, the battle could have dragged on for hours, with enormous casualties on both sides. However, this deadlock was exactly what Scipio had planned for. He knew that his cavalry, which had been missing from the battlefield for some time, was about to return at the perfect moment. The cavalry's return, the death blow to Hannibal's army. As the Carthaginian veterans fought desperately against the Roman infantry, a terrifying sound echoed across the battlefield, the thundering hooves of thousands of returning Roman and Numidian cavalrymen. Masiniss's Numidian cavalry struck first, attacking from one side and smashing into Hannibal's rear ranks. Laelius' Roman cavalry soon followed, charging from the other side and completing the encirclement. Hannibal's veterans, already engaged in brutal combat, now found themselves surrounded on all sides, with no escape. This devastating rear assault caused immediate chaos in the Carthaginian ranks. Panic spread quickly. Hannibal's troops, realizing they were surrounded, began to lose morale. Disorder broke out. With no clear line of retreat, soldiers were crushed together, unable to maneuver. The Roman infantry surged forward, seizing the opportunity to deliver the final blow. Hannibal's army collapses. For Hannibal's forces, this was the worst possible scenario. The very tactic he had used so effectively at Cannae, surrounding and annihilating a Roman army, was now being used against him. His men, despite their courage and experience, were now trapped with no way out. Many of his soldiers were cut down where they stood, unable to defend against attacks from all sides. Others tried to flee, only to be ridden down by Masiniss's fast-moving Numidian cavalry. Even the most disciplined Carthaginian veterans could not hold their formation under such overwhelming pressure. Hannibal, seeing that the battle was lost, now faced an impossible decision: fight to the death or attempt to escape. The Battle of Zama was more than just a physical confrontation between two powerful armies. It was a contest between two of history's greatest military minds, Hannibal Barca and Scipio Africanus. Both commanders were renowned for their brilliant strategic thinking, tactical adaptability, and ability to read the battlefield in real time. However, at Zama, the final battle of the Second Punic War, it was Scipio who emerged victorious, not because Hannibal lacked skill, but because Scipio had studied Hannibal's tactics and countered them perfectly. This battle was a rare clash between two commanders who understood deception, maneuver warfare, and psychological tactics. Hannibal had used these skills for nearly 2 decades, humiliating Rome with victories at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae, but Scipio had learned from Rome's past failures and adapted his strategies accordingly. Hannibal's tactical brilliance, the master of unpredictability. Hannibal was a commander unlike any Rome had ever faced before. His ability to outthink and outmaneuver his enemies had made him Rome's most feared adversary. Over the course of the Second Punic War, Hannibal had proven that he could win battles even when outnumbered by using a combination of ambush tactics, luring enemy forces into carefully planned traps; surprise strategies, crossing the Alps when no one expected it, marching through unpredictable terrain; psychological warfare, using fear, deception, and misinformation to weaken enemy morale; superior battlefield positioning, ensuring that his army always fought from an advantageous position. At Zama, Hannibal had one last chance to defeat Rome, and he carefully crafted a plan to do so. Knowing that he had inferior numbers and a less disciplined army, he devised a strategy based on wearing down the Roman legions before unleashing his elite veteran troops in a final decisive strike. Hannibal's strategy at Zama. Using war elephants to disrupt Roman formations, Hannibal placed dozens of war elephants at the front of his army, hoping they would cause chaos among the Roman ranks, breaking their tight formations. Layered infantry attacks. His army was arranged in 3 successive lines, with each line meant to weaken the Roman advance before the final engagement. Concealing his best troops until the end, Hannibal saved his most experienced veterans, the same soldiers who had defeated Rome at Cannae, for the final stage of the battle, ensuring they would fight only when the enemy was exhausted. Cavalry engagement. To secure the flanks, Hannibal deployed his own cavalry to counter the Roman and Numidian horsemen, hoping that his forces could at least hold their ground long enough to allow his infantry to win in the center. On paper, this was an excellent strategy, built on Hannibal's ability to adapt to his army's weaknesses while exploiting Rome's vulnerabilities. However, what Hannibal did not account for was Scipio's ability to anticipate and counter every move. Scipio's adaptability, learning from Rome's past mistakes. Unlike previous Roman generals who had underestimated Hannibal, Scipio Africanus had spent years studying his enemy's tactics. He had witnessed Rome's humiliating defeats at Hannibal's hands and had meticulously planned a way to counter them. Scipio understood that beating Hannibal required more than brute force. Rome had suffered devastating losses in previous battles because its generals had been too predictable, too rigid, and too aggressive without proper planning. Scipio, on the other hand, was willing to adapt and innovate, and this is what gave him the edge at Zama. Scipio's countermeasures against Hannibal's strategy. Neutralizing the war elephants. Scipio had studied how elephants had been used in previous battles and knew that they could cause massive disruption if they broke through enemy lines. Instead of meeting the elephant charge head-on, he created wide gaps in the Roman formation, allowing the elephants to pass harmlessly through without trampling his soldiers. His troops then targeted the elephants' handlers, causing panic among the animals and even turning some of them against the Carthaginian army. Exploiting the weakness of Hannibal's first 2 lines. Scipio recognized that Hannibal's first 2 lines consisted of inexperienced or unreliable soldiers, mercenaries, and local recruits. He ordered his troops not to charge recklessly, but instead to fight defensively and methodically, wearing down these troops before advancing further. When Hannibal's first 2 lines collapsed in disorder and panic, Scipio took advantage of the chaos and maintained Roman discipline, preventing his own army from becoming disorganized. Saving fresh troops for the final engagement. Scipio understood that Hannibal's veterans were his most dangerous asset, and he expected them to be saved for the final phase of the battle. Instead of committing all his troops early, Scipio held back a strong reserve force, ensuring that when the final clash occurred, his men would be fresh and ready, while Hannibal's veterans would already be tired from fighting through 2 failed lines of troops. Using cavalry more effectively. Unlike at Cannae, where Roman cavalry had been easily outmatched, Scipio had superior cavalry, thanks to his alliance with Masiniss's Numidians. Instead of allowing his cavalry to chase after Hannibal's fleeing horsemen, Scipio had instructed them to regroup and return at the right moment. When the final infantry engagement was at its peak, Masinissa and Laelius led the cavalry in a devastating rear attack, surrounding Hannibal's army and reversing the same encirclement tactic Hannibal had used at Cannae. Why Scipio's strategy worked. Scipio outmatched Hannibal not just in tactical execution, but in strategic planning. He knew that Hannibal's unpredictability was his greatest weapon, so Scipio prepared multiple contingencies, ensuring that he would not be caught off guard. Hannibal's army was a mix of different cultures and fighting styles, whereas Scipio's Roman legions were a unified, disciplined force. If he could survive Hannibal's early attacks and maintain his formations, he would eventually gain the upper hand. At Zama, Scipio turned Hannibal's own tactics against him. Instead of allowing himself to be outflanked, tricked, or encircled, he forced Hannibal into a battle of endurance and discipline, where the organized Roman army would always have the advantage. The battle of 2 brilliant generals. Hannibal fought with creativity, deception, and experience, but he lacked the resources he had once commanded in Italy. His forces, though valiant, were not enough to overcome Scipio's superior planning and Roman discipline. Scipio respected Hannibal's genius and had designed his entire battle plan around neutralizing Hannibal's strengths while maximizing Rome's advantages. By doing so, he accomplished something no Roman general before him had been able to do. He defeated Hannibal in open battle. As the battle neared its final moments, it became clear that Scipio's strategic adaptability had triumphed over Hannibal's tactical genius. The fate of Carthage and Rome now hung in the balance, with the outcome of Zama shaping the future of the ancient world. The Battle of Zama was not just a military defeat for Hannibal, it was the death knell for Carthage's dreams of supremacy. For nearly 2 decades, Hannibal had terrorized Rome, leading his armies through Italy, crushing Roman legions, and bringing the mighty republic to the brink of collapse. However, with his loss at Zama, all of those years of brilliant warfare came to a crushing end. The battle itself had been a spectacle of tactical genius on both sides, but in the end, Scipio Africanus had outmaneuvered Hannibal using discipline, strategic patience, and superior cavalry tactics. Now, as the dust settled on the battlefield, Carthage stood at the precipice of ruin. The once great power, which had dominated trade, commerce, and naval warfare in the Mediterranean, was now at the mercy of Rome. Hannibal's escape, the end of his military career. Despite his defeat, Hannibal did not die on the battlefield. Unlike many Carthaginian generals who had fallen with their troops in past wars, Hannibal recognized that his death here would accomplish nothing. Instead, he retreated from the battlefield, gathering what few soldiers he could and making his way back to Carthage. This decision was not one of cowardice, it was a strategic necessity. Hannibal understood that if he survived, he could still play a role in the political and diplomatic negotiations that would inevitably follow. Carthage was not yet completely destroyed, and if he could influence the peace terms, perhaps some measure of Carthaginian power could be preserved. However, his return to Carthage was met with disillusionment and betrayal. The Carthaginian Senate, once eager to support his campaigns, turned against him after his defeat. Many in the ruling class blamed Hannibal alone for the failure at Zama, despite the fact that they had refused to send him reinforcements when he needed them most. With the Roman army approaching and defeat inevitable, Hannibal was powerless to save his city from surrender. Though he attempted to rebuild Carthage's strength politically, Rome would never allow him to regain power. The once great general, the man who had nearly brought Rome to its knees, was soon forced into exile, spending the last years of his life as a fugitive, hunted by Rome. Rome's unforgiving peace terms, the end of Carthage's empire. After the victory at Zama, Scipio Africanus and the Roman Senate dictated harsh peace terms to Carthage. Unlike previous treaties, where Rome might have allowed its defeated enemies to retain some measure of autonomy, this time, Rome wanted to ensure that Carthage would never rise again as a serious threat. The terms of surrender were brutal and humiliating. Carthage was forced to surrender all of its overseas territories, including its holdings in Spain and North Africa. This effectively stripped Carthage of its status as an empire. Carthage's navy was dismantled. Once a maritime superpower, Carthage was now left with only a handful of ships for self-defense. A massive war indemnity was imposed. Carthage was ordered to pay a crushing sum of 10,000 talents of silver over 50 years, ensuring that its economy remained crippled. Carthage could not wage war without Roman permission, even against local African tribes, meaning it was left defenseless in its own homeland. Hannibal was exiled. Rome demanded that Carthage remove Hannibal from power, ensuring that he could never lead another military campaign. These terms were designed not just to weaken Carthage, but to keep it permanently under Rome's control. For the Carthaginians, it was not just a political defeat, it was the destruction of their way of life. Rome becomes the undisputed superpower. With Carthage effectively neutered, Rome emerged as the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. The Second Punic War had been a desperate struggle for survival, but with Hannibal defeated and Carthage humbled, Rome stood stronger than ever before. Roman expansion accelerated. With Carthage no longer a threat, Rome turned its attention to conquering new territories in Greece, Asia Minor, and beyond. Scipio Africanus was hailed as a hero. His victory at Zama cemented his legacy as one of Rome's greatest generals, earning him the title Africanus in honor of his triumph. Roman military dominance was now unquestioned. Having survived the worst crisis in its history, Rome had learned from its mistakes and developed a more professional, disciplined military force that would go on to conquer vast parts of the known world. The defeat of Carthage set the stage for Rome's future conquests. Over the next century, Rome would continue to expand, leading to the eventual creation of the Roman Empire. However, while Carthage had been weakened, it was not completely destroyed, not yet. The seeds of the Third Punic War. Although Carthage had been forced into submission, the hatred between Rome and Carthage did not disappear. Many in the Roman Senate, especially figures like Cato the Elder, still distrusted Carthage. Even though the city had accepted Rome's harsh peace terms, some Romans believed that as long as Carthage existed, it would always pose a future threat. This belief would eventually lead to one final, devastating conflict, the Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BCE, which would end with the complete destruction of Carthage. However, at the time of Zama, no one could have predicted just how far Rome's vengeance would go. For now, the Roman Republic had won its greatest war. Carthage was crippled, Hannibal was exiled, and the fate of the Mediterranean had been decided in Rome's favor.